Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into history's untold stories. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city or country in the comments and let us know. Which historical event would you like us to uncover next? The night was heavy. The air did not move. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. On a plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, something was about to happen that would shake the fragile confidence of slaveholders across the region. But at that moment, no one knew. Not the overseer walking confidently through the darkness. Not the enslaved families lying awake in their cabins. Not the planter sleeping under the illusion of control. Her name was Louisa. History does not give us the softness of her childhood. It does not tell us the name her mother whispered when she was small. But we know this. On that plantation, she had endured years of forced labor under a sun that burned skin raw. She had endured commands barked without mercy. She had endured fear that followed her even into the night. And on this particular night in 1847, something inside her had reached its breaking point. The overseer had a reputation. Other women avoided his path when possible. Men lowered their eyes when he passed. His boots were known by sound alone. When they struck dirt, silence followed. He believed himself untouchable. The law stood behind him. The whip hung at his side, and the cabins of enslaved women were not places he asked permission to enter. That evening, Louisa had worked longer than usual. Cotton sacks had been weighed, quotas barely met, threats had been delivered. When darkness fell, the quarters filled with exhausted bodies, but exhaustion does not guarantee sleep when fear is constant companion. Footsteps approached her cabin. Slow, deliberate. The latch lifted. There are moments in history where everything slows, where air thickens, where a decision is made in seconds that cannot be undone. What happened inside that cabin would not stay inside it for long. Neighbors later testified that they heard a struggle, a crash, then silence. Not the ordinary silence of night. A different kind. The kind that makes people hold their breath. When men arrived carrying lanterns, they did not find what they expected. The overseer was on the ground. Blood pooled beneath his head. Louisa stood nearby, chest rising and falling rapidly. In her hand was a heavy iron cooking tool, the kind used daily to prepare food over open flame. The same object that moments earlier had changed everything. She did not flee. She did not beg. Witnesses later described her expression as steady, almost calm. That calm unsettled them more than panic would have. The overseer, a man who had walked freely into any cabin he chose, was dead, and the enslaved woman who had struck him stood without apology. Word spread before sunrise. The planter's household woke to chaos. Patrol riders were dispatched. Neighbors gathered. And beneath the shock was something deeper. Fear. If one woman could do this, what else was possible? Louisa was arrested immediately, bound, questioned, pressed for confession. But here's what makes this story echo across time. She did not claim accident. She did not claim confusion. According to court notes, she stated plainly that she had defended herself. In Mississippi in 1847, self-defense did not exist for enslaved women. The law protected property, not bodies. The law assumed obedience, not resistance. Her words did not soften the response. They intensified it. The trial was swift, faster than truth could breathe. White planters filled the courtroom, not only to witness justice, but to ensure control. Because Louisa's act was not just about one dead overseer. It was about example. It was about what might happen if other women realized they were not entirely powerless. As testimony unfolded, tension gripped the plantation community. Some enslaved people were forced to speak. Others were warned to remain silent. Fear traveled through cabins like cold wind. Louisa sat restrained, listening to men debate her fate. Men who had never lived her vulnerability. Men who had never felt a door open at night without consent. The verdict was predictable. Guilty. The sentence was death. But here is the part history rarely lingers on. The days between sentence and execution. Those days are heavy. They stretch long. Every sunrise becomes precious. Every sound becomes sharper. Louisa knew what awaited her. Public execution. Forced attendance. A message carved in spectacle. And yet, accounts describe her demeanor as steady, not hysterical, not pleading. Steady. The plantation owners believed hanging her would restore order. They believed fear would return to its proper place. But beneath the spectacle of punishment, something had already shifted. An illusion had cracked. The overseer had believed himself invincible. He had entered that cabin with the confidence of a system behind him. And in a single moment, that system failed him. Louisa's act was not a coordinated revolt. It was not thousands rising at once. It was something more intimate, more terrifying to those in power. It was a woman deciding that her body would not be taken again without consequence. On the morning of her execution, enslaved families were forced to gather. Children stood beside parents. The rope waited. Planters watched closely. They wanted fear restored. But as Louisa walked forward, witnesses noted something unsettling. She did not hang her head. She did not crumble. She faced the crowd. History does not preserve her final words. Perhaps the silence itself was her final statement. What happened that night in 1847 did not spark a mass uprising, but it exposed a truth the plantation system feared deeply. Control maintained by violence can be broken by defiance, even by one person. And as the rope tightened and the crowd dispersed, whispers began. Not loud, not reckless, but real. If Louisa could resist, even at the cost of her life, what did that mean for others? This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a crack in the foundation of fear. And in the shadows of Mississippi plantations, that crack would not easily disappear. Please in need, you do always add suspense going forward when you write. Rewrite Party 1. Make the hook strong, and add suspense to keep the listener to watch more, and encourage audience retention. The plantation returned to its rhythm, at least on the surface. Cotton still had to be picked. Fields still had to be cleared. Meals still had to be cooked over open flames. But beneath that rhythm, something invisible had shifted. Before Louisa, the overseer's footsteps meant one thing: absolute power. After Louisa, those same footsteps carried uncertainty. Not because enslaved people suddenly rose up. They did not. Survival still required caution. But fear had cracked on both sides. White men began moving differently. They carried weapons more often. They avoided walking alone at night. They studied the faces of the enslaved more carefully, searching for defiance. Suspicion replaced arrogance, and that suspicion was exhausting. Because once a system realizes it is vulnerable, it can never fully relax again. In nearby plantations, word traveled quietly, not through newspapers, not through official reports, through glances, through coded warnings, through the way women tightened their grip on iron tools when certain men approached. Louisa's act did not create immediate rebellion. It created awareness. Awareness that the line between power and consequence was thinner than many believed. Some enslaved women began to shift their posture slightly. Subtle changes, not enough to draw punishment, but enough to signal something internal. A refusal to shrink entirely. The knowledge that one woman had fought back altered how they imagined their own limits. And that is what unsettled slaveholders most. They understood control depended on psychological dominance. It depended on convincing the enslaved that resistance was futile, that punishment was inevitable, that power was permanent. Louisa had disproven permanence in one violent moment. There were meetings among planters across Adams County, discussions about discipline, about stricter oversight, about preventing another incident. They rarely spoke her name. But she was the reason for the conversation. Some blamed the overseer himself. Quietly, behind closed doors. They questioned his behavior, not out of moral outrage, but because recklessness had cost them stability. That admission, even whispered, revealed something important. The system knew its own cruelty could backfire, yet public narrative never shifted. Official accounts described her as dangerous, as example of why strict control was necessary. They framed her resistance as proof that brutality must be answered with more brutality. That is how oppressive systems protect themselves. They rewrite defiance as savagery. But among enslaved communities, interpretation was different. Louisa had defended herself. She had refused violation. She had chosen death over continued assault. That choice, however tragic, carried meaning. Years later, when other acts of resistance occurred across Mississippi, older women would sometimes say quietly, "Remember what happened in Adams County." They did not need to explain further. The memory was shared. History rarely records the emotional aftershocks of events like this. It records dates, verdicts, sentences, but it does not record the trembling hands of a young woman that night as she realized she had crossed a point of no return. It does not record the internal calculation that must have happened in seconds. Stay silent and endure, or fight and face death. She chose to fight. And that choice complicates the narrative of enslaved women as passive victims. They were strategists of survival. They weighed risks constantly. They endured in silence when necessary, and sometimes, when pushed beyond limit, they resisted openly. Louisa's story also forces us to confront the brutal reality that enslaved women faced dual oppression, labor exploitation, and sexual vulnerability. Their bodies were seen as tools and as targets. The law offered no refuge. That context matters deeply when examining her act. She was not attacking from position of power. She was defending from position of extreme vulnerability. As the 1850s approached, tensions across the South intensified. Debates over slavery grew louder in national politics. The system was beginning to fracture under its own contradictions. But on plantations, daily life remained harsh and unyielding. Yet stories like Louisa's remind us that beneath the surface of forced labor, resistance simmered constantly. Sometimes in poison slipped quietly into food. Sometimes in tools broken deliberately. Sometimes in escape attempts under cover of darkness. And sometimes in direct confrontation. Her name did not make headlines beyond local record. She did not become symbol in her lifetime, but she represents countless unnamed women who made similar calculations and whose stories were never written at all. If we close our eyes and imagine that night again, we can feel the weight of it. The sound of boots outside a cabin. the creak of a door opening without invitation. The breath held in fear. The split-second decision. The swing of iron through air. History turns on moments like that. Not always large battles. Not always famous speeches. Sometimes, a single act in a small cabin shifts the emotional balance of an entire plantation. Louisa did not survive the system. The system ended her life, but she did something the system feared deeply. She proved that even under absolute control, defiance was possible. And once that truth enters the community, it cannot be fully removed. Her story lives in the shadows, exactly where many powerful truths live. Not loudly celebrated, not comfortably discussed, but present. Waiting. Reminding us that even in the darkest corners of American slavery, there were women who chose resistance, no matter the cost. As seasons changed and years moved forward, the memory of that night did not fade as quickly as the planters hoped. Cotton grew, was harvested, and shipped downriver. New overseers were hired, new threats were made, but something invisible had taken root in Adams County. Fear no longer belonged to only one side. The enslaved still rose before dawn. They still bent beneath the weight of sacks. They still endured punishment. But beneath obedience, there was calculation. Beneath silence, awareness. Louisa's act had proven that the body of an enslaved woman was not an empty vessel without will. It carried decision. It carried consequence. White men began traveling in pairs more often. Doors were knocked on before entering. Not always. Not everywhere. But enough to signal caution. Even arrogance has limits when blood has been spilled. And here is what made it even more unsettling. Louisa had not organized a rebellion. She had not rallied hundreds. She had not sent secret messages across counties. She had acted alone. That meant the danger was not centralized. It could rise anywhere, from anyone, at any moment. That unpredictability terrified the system more than organized revolt ever could. In the quarters, older women began speaking differently to younger girls. Their warnings still carried fear, but they also carried something else. Strategy. Watch carefully. Stay alert. Know your surroundings, and if ever you must choose your dignity first. Those lessons were not spoken loudly. They were folded into daily instruction, passed quietly while shelling peas or mending clothes. The plantation owners responded the only way they knew how, with stricter enforcement, more patrols, more surveillance. They believed that tightening the grip would restore order, but tightening a grip too hard can cause cracks to spread. Because the truth was this: Louisa had exposed vulnerability in a system built on dominance. She had shown that a single moment of resistance could dismantle the illusion of total control. Years later, when Mississippi debated secession and the nation drifted toward civil war, the memory of slave resistance haunted conversations behind closed doors. Planters knew that if war broke out, enslaved populations might rise. They remembered stories like the one from 1847. They remembered that submission was not guaranteed. Louisa never saw emancipation. She never heard the news in 1865 that slavery had been abolished. But the spirit behind her act aligned with the coming storm. The system she struck against was already trembling under national tension. It is important to sit with that image again. A small cabin, night air thick, a door opening without consent, and one woman deciding that enough had finally arrived. That moment was not born in anger alone. It was born in accumulated injustice, in repeated violation, in daily humiliation. Resistance rarely erupts without long preparation of suffering, And this is what keeps her story alive, even in fragments. She represents countless enslaved women whose acts were never recorded at all. Women who fought back and were silenced. Women who endured silently because resistance meant certain death. Women who calculated survival differently. Louisa's name survives in faint court records. Many others do not, but their courage existed just the same. When we tell her story, we are not glorifying violence. We are confronting the violence she lived under daily. We are acknowledging that slavery was not simply forced labor. It was physical, psychological, and sexual domination enforced by law. Her blow was not the beginning of violence. It was response to it. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth for those who held power. They wanted enslaved people to internalize helplessness. Louisa did not. In that moment, she chose agency over fear, even knowing the price. History often remembers large revolts and famous leaders, but sometimes the most powerful resistance happens in silence before it is ever spoken aloud. Sometimes it happens when one woman refuses to let the door close behind her without consequence. The rope ended her life, but it did not erase the crack she left behind. Because once a system has been challenged, even once, it can never fully pretend it is invincible again. And in the humid night air of Mississippi, long after the crowd dispersed and the gallows were dismantled, that truth lingered. Quiet, uncomfortable, unavoidable. Even after years passed and new overseers took the place of the one who died, something in Adams County never quite settled back into its old rhythm. The plantation bell still rang at dawn. The cotton still filled sacks. The whip still cracked across backs. But beneath routine, there was memory. And memory is harder to control than bodies. You must understand something about systems built on fear. They function best when the oppressed believe resistance is impossible. Not difficult. Not dangerous. Impossible. Louisa shattered that illusion in a single night. The overseer had walked into her cabin, certain of outcome. He believed the law shielded him. He believed power guaranteed safety. He believed her silence was permanent. But that belief ended in blood. And once the myth of untouchability breaks, it never fully repairs. White planters began scanning faces differently. They began reading eyes instead of only counting cotton. They began wondering what thoughts hid behind lowered heads. That kind of suspicion erodes confidence. It breeds paranoia. In the enslaved quarters, daily life continued. But conversations carried deeper undercurrents. There were no speeches praising Louisa. That would have been fatal. But stories have ways of surviving without names attached. The story of the woman who fought back traveled in coded form. It became lesson. Warning. Reminder. Young girls growing into womanhood heard it in fragments. Not all at once. A mention here. A caution there. An older woman's hand tightening around theirs when certain men passed. These small gestures carried meaning. And that is how resistance spreads. Not always through banners and marching feet. Sometimes through posture, through shared memory, through the quiet knowledge that submission is not destiny. The plantation owners increased discipline. They demanded stricter supervision at night, but something subtle had changed. Overseers no longer walked with quite the same swagger. Some carried pistols where they once carried only whips. That detail matters. It reveals fear. Fear works both ways. And in Mississippi in the 1840s, fear was currency. Louisa's act forced slaveholders to confront something they tried to ignore. Enslaved women were not simply laborers. They were thinkers. They were decision makers. They were capable of calculating risk. They were capable of deadly defense when pushed beyond survival limits. For a system that depended on the image of docility, that realization was dangerous. Years later, when civil war finally erupted across the nation, plantation owners panicked about uprisings. They remembered past incidents. They remembered Nat Turner. They remembered whispers of conspiracies. And though Louisa's act had not been organized revolt, they remembered that too. Because the most terrifying resistance is often the unpredictable kind. The kind that cannot be mapped, cannot be anticipated, cannot be prevented with a single new law. Louisa's name faded from official conversation, but the lesson did not. Her act lingered as proof that even the most controlled system contains pressure points. Pressure builds slowly. It accumulates in humiliation, in assault, in hunger, in exhaustion. And when it releases, it does not always announce itself first. Imagine again that split second. The overseer inside the cabin. The door closing. The weight of iron in her hand. The decision forming. She knew the consequence. She knew there would be no mercy. And still she swung. That moment was not born from recklessness. It was born from years of swallowed fear. History often asks us to measure impact by numbers. How many rose up? How many died? How many laws changed? But some impact is measured in silence, in altered posture, in guarded footsteps. After 1847, that plantation never again believed itself completely secure. And security is the foundation of power. When that foundation cracks, even slightly, the entire structure trembles. Louisa did not live to see freedom declared. She did not see the day when chains were legally broken. But her act belonged to the long chain of resistance that made slavery impossible to sustain forever. She stands in history, not as headline, not as celebrated heroine in her time, but as evidence. Evidence that enslaved women were not voiceless shadows. Evidence that even in the darkest cabins, there were decisions being made. Evidence that power can be challenged, even if only for a moment. And perhaps that is why her story still unsettles, because it reminds us that oppression never goes uncontested, not fully, not quietly. Somewhere in Mississippi, beneath unmarked ground, lies the body of a woman who refused to endure one more violation. But the echo of that refusal did not die with her. It traveled. Through whispers. Through tightened grips on iron. Through the steady eyes of women who remembered. And in that echo, we find a truth the plantation system tried desperately to suppress. Even in chains, there were those who chose to fight back. And long after the gallows were dismantled and the overseer replaced, the plantation carried an invisible scar. You could not see it in the fields. You could not touch it in the cotton bales, but it existed. It lived in hesitation. It lived in the pause before a door was opened at night. Because something irreversible had happened. Louisa had shown that fear could break direction. It did not have to flow one way. It could turn. It could reverse. For generations, the system had relied on a predictable script. Overseer commands. Enslaved obey. Punishment delivered. Silence follows. That script had been interrupted, and once interrupted, it could never be performed with the same certainty again. The new overseer who replaced the dead man walked the grounds with sharper eyes. He had heard the story. Everyone had. He knew how his predecessor died, and though he carried authority, he also carried caution. That caution was new. White planters rarely admitted vulnerability, but in private conversations, some began acknowledging the risks of unchecked cruelty, not because their hearts softened, but because instability threatened profit. That subtle shift reveals something important. Louisa's act forced reflection, even among those who held power. In the quarters, older enslaved women became even more watchful. They measured danger in silence. They studied the moods of men in charge. They adjusted survival strategies accordingly. But beneath their caution, something steady remained. The knowledge that one of their own had drawn a line. Imagine a young girl growing up years later on that same land. She hears fragments of a story. The woman who struck back. The woman who did not beg. The woman who walked to the rope with her head high. That story shapes her sense of possibility. Not recklessness, but dignity. Because dignity can survive even where freedom cannot. Louisa's resistance was not organized revolution. It did not topple plantations overnight. But revolutions are not only built from large armies. They are built from countless small refusals that accumulate over time. The plantation system depended on the belief that enslaved people would always choose survival over confrontation. Louisa complicated that belief. She proved that there were moments when survival without dignity was not enough. That realization lingers. When historians look back at slavery in Mississippi, they often focus on economics, on cotton yields, on expansion westward. But beneath those statistics are stories like this one. Stories of women whose names were almost erased. Stories of cabins where resistance erupted in private. Stories that reveal the emotional cost of bondage and the fierce human instinct to reclaim agency. As the nation moved toward civil war, slaveholders feared uprising from within just as much as invasion from outside. They remembered that control was never absolute. They remembered that enslaved communities communicated in ways that escaped surveillance, and somewhere in those fears was the memory of a woman who refused to endure. Louisa did not leave behind letters. She did not leave behind recorded speeches, but she left behind impact. Impact in posture, in whispered warning, in the altered confidence of men who once believed themselves untouchable. And perhaps that is the most powerful form of resistance, not always visible in monuments, not always celebrated in textbooks, but alive in the subtle shifts of power and perception. Her life ended in 1847, but the crack she left in that plantation's illusion of control did not close easily. Because once a system learns it can bleed, it can never fully pretend to be immortal again. And in the humid stillness of Mississippi nights, long after her name faded from court records, the memory remained. A reminder that even in the tightest grip of oppression, there were moments when the oppressed reached back, moments when iron met flesh, moments when silence shattered, moments when fear changed direction. Louisa's story lives in those moments, quiet, unsettling, unfinished. Years rolled forward, and the plantation landscape of Mississippi changed with the coming of war. Cannons thundered in distant states. Armies marched. Rumors traveled faster than horses, and as Confederate lines weakened, enslaved people listened closely. They had learned long ago that change often began as a whisper before it became a roar. Some of the enslaved who had stood in that crowd in 1847 were older now. Their backs bent further, their hair turned gray, but memory does not wrinkle the way skin does. They still remembered the morning Louisa was hanged. They still remembered the way she did not collapse into tears. They still remembered the silence afterward, when Union soldiers eventually moved through parts of Mississippi and news of emancipation began to spread. There were tears in the quarters. Cautious tears at first. Disbelief. Could it be true? Could chains really fall without another rope tightening around a neck? For some, Louisa's name returned in those moments. Not shouted, not publicly honored, but remembered quietly. She had not lived to see this day, but she had lived as if freedom mattered more than fear. And that matters, because history is not only shaped by those who survive long enough to see victory, it is shaped by those who act before victory seems possible. Louisa acted when there was no army behind her, no proclamation of freedom waiting, no law prepared to defend her. She acted when resistance meant certain death. Emancipation in 1865 did not erase trauma. It did not restore lost years. It did not bring Louisa back, but it confirmed something she had already demonstrated. Slavery was not unbreakable. It was not permanent. It could be challenged. It could fall. In the Reconstruction years that followed, Black communities in Mississippi built churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. They organized politically. They voted. They spoke publicly. That period was brief and violently contested, but it represented possibility. And beneath that possibility lay generations of resistance, some organized, some quiet, some personal. Louisa's act belonged to that foundation. When white supremacist violence returned during the late 19th century, when Jim Crow laws tightened and terror spread, memory became shield again. Stories of resistance, even tragic ones, reminded Black communities that endurance had always been accompanied by defiance. Louisa's story may not appear in national archives in bold letters, but her life represents something central to understanding slavery. Enslaved women were not passive figures in the background of history. They were participants in survival and resistance. They made decisions under impossible conditions. They bore the double weight of labor and violation. And sometimes they struck back. If we close our eyes once more and return to that night in 1847, we can feel the tension in the air, the heavy stillness, the sound of a latch lifting, the weight of iron in a trembling hand, the choice forming in silence. That choice was born of accumulated injustice. It was not spontaneous rage. It was threshold crossed, and thresholds matter. They mark the point where endurance ends and action begins. Louisa crossed hers knowing the price. That knowledge makes her act even more powerful. She did not act under illusion. She acted under clarity. And clarity under oppression is dangerous. Her execution was meant to erase example. Instead, it created one. Not an invitation to reckless violence, but a reminder that human dignity has limits, that even under chains, there is a line that cannot always be pushed without consequence. Today, when we speak her name, we are restoring weight to a woman history tried to flatten into a court record. We are acknowledging that beneath statistics of cotton production were lives filled with fear, courage, and impossible decisions. Louisa of Mississippi stands as a symbol of brutal resistance, not because she sought violence, but because she refused violation. Her story forces us to confront the raw realities of slavery and the human instinct to reclaim control when every other option has been stripped away. She did not survive the system, but she wounded its certainty. And sometimes, wounding certainty is the beginning of collapse. Even after Reconstruction faded and new chains were forged through segregation, the deeper story of resistance never disappeared. It adapted. It moved quietly from generation to generation. And though Louisa's name was rarely written, the essence of what she did remained part of a larger inheritance. In Mississippi, as the 19th century turned into the 20th, terror did not end. Lynchings replaced gallows. Sharecropping replaced plantations. The language of law changed, but control remained aggressive. Yet through all of it, the memory of resistance lived in family stories. Stories told at kitchen tables. Stories shared while braiding hair. Stories that warned and strengthened at the same time. Louisa became one of those stories, maybe not always by name, sometimes simply described as the woman who refused, the woman who chose death over continued violation, the woman who made a powerful man bleed. And in that description was something vital, because resistance is not always about winning. Sometimes it is about drawing a boundary that history cannot ignore. When future generations faced injustice, whether under Jim Crow or during the Civil Rights Movement, they carried the accumulated courage of those who had resisted before them. The marches of the 1950s and 1960s were built upon centuries of quieter defiance. Louisa's act belongs to that long arc. Her story reminds us that enslaved women were not only survivors, they were decision-makers under unbearable pressure. They calculated risk with precision. They endured when endurance was necessary. And when endurance threatened to erase their humanity completely, some chose confrontation. Imagine what it meant for a woman in 1847 to lift iron against a white overseer. Not only physical risk, but social earthquake. The entire system rested on racial hierarchy and gender domination. Her act shattered both in one motion. That is why it terrified slaveholders, not only because a man died, but because a myth died with him. The myth that enslaved women would always submit. Even in death, Louisa unsettled power. Years after emancipation, when former enslaved families gathered to remember the past, they did not speak only of suffering. They spoke of resistance. They spoke of those who ran, those who hid fugitives, those who poisoned quietly, those who struck back. These stories built pride alongside pain. Pain alone can crush a people. But pain paired with stories of defiance builds resilience. Louisa's act did not dismantle slavery by itself, but it chipped at its psychological armor, and systems built on psychological control are weakened each time that armor cracks. If we look across American history, we see a pattern. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways. Some revolted openly. Some sabotaged tools. Some educated themselves in secret. Some fled northward. And some, like Louisa, defended their bodies in moments when no other protection existed. Her resistance was brutal because the world she lived in was brutal. It was not an act of cruelty born from comfort. It was an act born from survival. That distinction matters. When we tell her story with suspense and gravity, it is not to sensationalize violence. It is to restore context, to remind listeners that behind every explosive moment was a slow burn of injustice. Picture once more that Mississippi night. Heavy air, wooden walls, a door opening without permission, and one woman deciding that fear would not be the only force in that room. That decision echoes. It echoes in the posture of women who later stood up to segregation. It echoes in the voices that demanded voting rights. It echoes in every act where dignity is chosen over silence. Louisa's grave remains unmarked. The earth does not carry her name in stone, but history carries her imprint, not in grand monuments, in tremors, in subtle shifts, in the knowledge that no system of oppression ever operates without challenge. She lived in chains. She died by rope. But in between, she proved something powerful. Even in the most tightly controlled space, the human will can rise. And that truth, once revealed, can never be completely buried. And as we stand back from her story, we must ask ourselves something difficult. Why are names like Louisa's so faint in the record? Why do we have fragments instead of full biographies? Why do we know the names of overseers and planters more clearly than the women who endured them? The answer is painful. History was written by those in power. Court documents recorded verdicts, not emotions. Plantation ledgers tracked productivity, not trauma. When enslaved women resisted, the record focused on the disruption, not the suffering that led to it. But fragments are enough. Fragments tell us there was a night. There was a struggle. There was iron in her hand. There was blood on the floor. There was a courtroom that refused to see self-defense. There was a gallows built to restore fear. And there was a woman who did not beg for mercy. That is enough to know she existed. That is enough to understand her courage. As the decades unfolded after slavery ended, Mississippi did not become gentle overnight. Sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt. Racial terror kept communities under threat. New laws restricted movement and opportunity. But something fundamental had shifted in the nation. Slavery as legal structure had collapsed. Louisa had lived and died before that collapse. Yet her act belongs to the long pressure that made collapse inevitable. Systems crack not only from outside attack, but from internal resistance that weakens them over time. Her story reminds us that enslaved women were central to that internal resistance. They were not only laborers, they were culture bearers, strategists, protectors of children, quiet organizers, and when necessary, fighters. Imagine her one last time. Not only on the gallows, not only in the cabin. Imagine her as a girl once, perhaps laughing, before chains defined her days. Imagine her learning quickly how to read moods, how to sense danger. Imagine her calculating every movement in a world that treated her body as property. Then imagine the moment she decided enough was enough. That decision is human, deeply human. It transcends time. It transcends geography. It speaks to something in all of us that resists domination. And this is why stories like hers matter for shadows of Black history. Because the shadows hold truths that mainstream history often overlooks. They hold the fierce, intimate acts that never made headlines, but shaped emotional landscapes. Louisa's resistance was not polished. It was not strategic in the political sense. It was raw, immediate, born from a line crossed too many times. That rawness makes it powerful. Even now, as we retell her story, we feel the tension. We feel the suspense of that door opening. We feel the weight of iron in trembling hands. We feel the silence before impact. That suspense is not fiction. It is the lived reality of countless enslaved women whose nights carried threat. And so we do not end her story with execution alone. We end it with echo. An echo that traveled across plantations. An echo that unsettled men who thought themselves invincible. An echo that strengthened women who needed to remember they were not powerless. Louisa of Mississippi may not have left behind descendants who could publicly tell her story. She may not have left written testimony, but she left impact. And sometimes, impact is louder than survival. Her life forces us to confront the brutality of slavery honestly. It forces us to acknowledge the agency of those trapped within it. It forces us to remember that resistance did not always look like organized revolt. Sometimes, it looked like one woman in one cabin making a choice that would cost her everything. And in that choice, we see the unbreakable thread that runs through Black history. A refusal to be erased. A refusal to surrender dignity entirely. A refusal to accept injustice as natural law. Louisa stood alone that night, but she was never truly alone in history. But let us go even deeper, because what truly lingers about Louisa's story is not just the violence of that night. It is the build-up, the slow tightening, the years of swallowing fear, the constant calculation, the knowledge that no court would protect her. No law would defend her body. No white witness would risk speaking for her. Imagine living in that reality every single day. Waking before sunrise. Working until muscles burn. Listening for footsteps after dark. Pretending not to notice eyes, watching too closely. Laughing carefully. Speaking carefully. Existing carefully. Careful survival is exhausting. And exhaustion changes people. It sharpens some. It breaks others. It pushes many to the edge silently. Louisa reached that edge. The difference is she did not step back from it. When the door opened that night, it was not the first time she had heard that sound. That is what makes the suspense unbearable. It was routine, and routine violation is its own form of psychological warfare. But something was different this time. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her. Perhaps it was the threat in his voice. Perhaps it was simply the final drop in an already overflowing cup. Whatever it was, the calculation shifted. She knew the law would not protect her. She knew any resistance would be punished. She knew the system would not side with her word over his. And still, she moved. That movement is the heartbeat of this story, because it represents the exact moment fear stopped being the strongest force in the room. The overseer believed he controlled the script. He believed the night would end, as it always had. He believed she would endure. But he miscalculated. He underestimated the accumulation of silent rage. He underestimated the survival instinct that transforms into defense when every other boundary has been crossed. The blow landed. History rarely describes the sound, but you can almost hear it. Iron meeting bone. The sudden disruption of certainty. The gasp that follows when power realizes it is mortal. And then silence. That silence must have been thick. Thick with shock. Thick with realization. Thick with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. When lantern light flooded the cabin and men saw what had happened, they were not only angry, they were stunned, because this was not supposed to happen. Not here. Not like this. Not from her. She did not run. That detail matters deeply. Running would have meant guilt in their eyes, but she stood there, breathing, shaking, but standing. That stance alone was defiance, and when she said she defended herself, she was not pleading. She was stating fact. In her reality, that was truth. In their reality, it was rebellion. The trial was never about justice. It was about restoring narrative control. They needed the story rewritten. They needed her, framed as monster instead of woman. Because if she remained woman in public imagination, other women might see themselves in her, and that was unacceptable. So they built the gallows. They gathered the crowd. They forced attendance. They tried to turn her into warning. But warnings do not always land as intended. Sometimes they land as inspiration. Not reckless inspiration, not immediate uprising, but deep internal shift. A recognition that power bleeds, that authority is not divine, that even the most feared man can fall. That recognition spreads slowly, quietly, like water seeping into soil. Louisa's story is not loud in the archives, but it is thunderous in meaning. It forces us to confront the intimate brutality of slavery. Not just chains and auctions, but doors opening without consent. Power exercised in darkness. Violence disguised as entitlement. And it forces us to confront the courage required to interrupt that pattern. She did not have backup. She did not have legal strategy. She did not have national attention. She had a moment. And she seized it. The rope ended her life. But it did not end the tension she introduced into that plantation. Because once fear changes direction, it never fully returns to its original shape. And that is why we tell her story in Shadows of Black History. Because in the shadows are women like Louisa. Women whose names were nearly erased. Women who were labeled criminal instead of courageous. Women whose resistance was buried under the weight of official narrative. But buried does not mean gone. Her story still breathes. In the pause before a door opens. In the tightening of a hand around iron. In the moment, someone decides they will not endure one more violation. Louisa of Mississippi reminds us that even under the harshest oppression, there were those who chose to fight back. And sometimes, that choice echoes longer than the system that tried to silence it.